events, which is good because I want to get the word out there, but it's really compressed my schedule, so I appreciate your bearing with me. So I did just publish a book called Housing for All. It was published last week. Tomorrow at Politics and Prose Union Market at 7 p.m. I'll be talking about it. So if you're able to come, that would be wonderful. I would love to have you there, and I can share the details with Robin, who I'm sure can get that to you.
Yeah, we'll send that on out.
So I really appreciate libraries. Libraries are critical places for all kinds of reasons, and libraries are not intended to be sort of outreach sites, but have become that, and that's something to really appreciate because you all are taking this on without, this being intended as part of the role of libraries. So it's very valuable what you are doing and needs to be supported, but it's kind of a stopgap measure, I think. It's not how things should be working. There should be resources in the city for housing first and foremost. Additional supports that some people need, like mental health services, should be available. We know these things are not available, and that's what I would like to speak to briefly here. My work has been at the national level, so I'm not so much engaged in city politics. You all are the experts on that. But I can speak to what's been happening nationally for the past 4 decades. When I first got involved in working on this issue, it was kind of the very beginning of the crisis in the early 1980s. And that's really when the modern crisis of homelessness as we know it today began in this country. And it was not an accident. Homelessness didn't just sort of appear out of nowhere. In 1981, you may remember, or I don't know if you remember, I remember, but not everyone does. But it's important to know that Ronald Reagan came into office promising to make America great, and he came in on a promise to shrink the size of the federal government, and he did. And what that meant was drastically cutting the social safety net that was then in place. And housing in particular took a huge hit. So housing was cut before Reagan came in 1979. There were over 300,000 units that year of new housing affordable to poor people were funded. In 1982, that number was down to under 3,000. So this is a huge, huge cut. And some funding has been restored, but the gap has not been filled by any stretch. So those cuts and their implications, their effects are still with us today. And they are driving the crisis of homelessness. Right now, only 1 in 4 of people who are eligible, poor enough to be eligible for housing assistance, actually receives it. So that's huge. Meanwhile, changes in the private housing market have continued to also drive the crisis. So this started even before Reagan's cuts in the 1970s. That's when we really start seeing the loss of single-room occupancy housing. That's a source of inexpensive housing for a lot of people. Over 1 million units were lost in the 1970s. So Reagan's cuts came on top of this existing loss and really just triggered the crisis of modern day homelessness. And that's when we start to see, homelessness had been very limited to skid rows of major cities affecting primarily single men. In the early 80s, we start seeing the entire country being affected, suburbs, rural areas, cities all across the country. Families and children start becoming homeless, working people, working and yet not being able to pay for housing. All of this is still happening today, and it's worse. So all of these, so I want to, since I know there's a particular concern here with mental health issues, I want to just pause and say that mental health crises or in deinstitutionalization, which came much earlier, starting in the 50s and 60s, these are not the causes of homelessness. The cause of homelessness is the lack of affordable housing. Some people need more and need mental health care and substance abuse care. Lots of Americans do. These are not limited to people who are experiencing homelessness. But the driving cause, the common denominator, is the lack of affordable housing. No treatment, no help is going to work if you don't have housing. So we've got to really focus on this. And of course, every single person who becomes homeless has their own individual story. And some people may become homeless because of mental health issues. I don't doubt that. I know that that's the case, or because of drug issues. But the key driver and the key solution is housing. We know that there's an approach called Housing First. Housing First is something that works, and there's a lot of evidence to back it up. But Housing First can't work if there's no housing. For Housing First to be effective, you need the housing. And right now, Housing First is helping a lot of people, but it's not nearly enough. It's not to scale, and that's because there's not housing. So, you know, back in the 80s, when I was first working on this, one of the initiatives that I worked on was getting the federal government to respond to homelessness. And that was very hard at the time, because we had a president who was saying, not only cutting programs, but also promoting this narrative, a very harmful narrative that people are homeless by choice. Mm-hmm. It's a lifestyle choice. It's not a policy issue. It's not a matter of social policy. It's a matter of individual choice and individual failure that people are homeless. So, you know, this is a very destructive narrative that is still with us today. Not only still with us, but it's been embraced, and it's now become a bipartisan narrative. And, you know, we started down this road with Reagan. Bill Clinton did not help. He also launched his campaign on the promise to end welfare as we know it, and demonized and stigmatized poor people. And so we have this narrative that people choose to be homeless. Like one day people wake up and decide they'd like to live on the street. That's a false narrative, but this false narrative is still there. We have Gavin Newsom, for example, embracing this narrative, and it's not limited to Republicans. Democrats are embracing this narrative as well. So you know, meanwhile, things are getting worse. The foreclosure crisis caused a big bump in homelessness. A lot of people lost their homes, became homeless for the first time. The foreclosure crisis was also a way that this trend that's been happening in the private market of deregulation, of privatization, of what we call now commodification of housing really accelerated. So housing is something that everybody needs. It's a human need. You know, everybody needs a safe, stable, affordable place to live. But it's become a vehicle for profit. And it's become something that, you know, people, I'm not talking about like individuals who view their homes as investment, or, you know, mom and pop landlords who rent an additional home. I'm talking about big institutional corporate investors who are latching on to housing as a source of profit. And, you know, we have the phenomenon of mortgages securing financial instruments, financialization of housing now being traded on the stock market, where the only concern is profit. And that's where the private market now has led us, so that housing is now a commodity.
Marina,
Yes.
I don't want to interrupt your thoughts, but I know there are a lot of people who have questions about the market and housing and so forth. Do you have time for just a couple questions?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
So one thing,
Am
as
I
you know,
taking
in our
too much time?
neighborhood,
Yes.
so 1617 U Street, there's a
Right.
proposal to do social housing.
Yes.
I don't know if people are familiar with that, but as multi-income levels all in one building. It's
Right.
widely done in Europe and other places, but hasn't quite taken hold in the United States, although there is a place in Montgomery County.
Yes.
But are you a
I'm
fan?
ready to talk to that, about,
Please.
yes. Tell me if I'm taking too much time though. I'm at the coming.
It would just be great, I think a couple of people could ask you questions
Yes,
when you're done.
absolutely. Okay, so stepping back. So this is where we are, stepping back. What can we do?
What can we do?
And social housing is critical. So I want to say, first of all, I think we need to acknowledge that housing is a basic human right. Okay, international human rights law recognizes it as such. This country used to recognize it. The United States used to recognize that housing for all is a goal and has to be something we work towards. It's never been enshrined as a right in our Constitution. It should be. It is a human right. So one way to implement housing as a human right is through something called social housing. And this is a model that has been implemented in other countries. It's been successful in Finland, for example, which has a right to housing in its constitution. Finland has made great strides in ending homelessness. Other countries and cities, like the city of Vienna, has a very successful model of social housing. The United States has models of social housing. Montgomery County, which Robin mentioned, is one such model, but there's others, and there's fights underway right now in communities around the country that are succeeding in developing social housing. Seattle, for example, has a campaign called House Our Neighbors that just created, or in the past few years, created at the city level a social housing developer. And just earlier this year, by referendum, passed with almost 60% of the vote funding for this model. So, these are examples. There's a campaign going on in Kansas City. These are examples of what can be done at the local level. It is possible to have victories at the local level. Of course, we need the federal government and to really solve this problem, but it is possible, and we have to. I think it's key to get behind efforts and get behind this message that housing is a basic human right, and what does it mean, and look at the examples of how to implement it in practice. I'll just say one more thing, which is, there is also public housing. I mean, social housing is similar to what we call public housing, which we used to have in our country, and which was massively defunded, allowed to deteriorate, and then criticized for being in bad shape and demonized. And now it's almost like you can't even talk about it, but I think we must, because housing is a public good, and it requires an investment of public resources.
Is all this in your book?
This is all in my book.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yes.
in the book. And housing for all.
Yes, and
Great
housing for all. Just as we have injustice for all, we need housing for all.